For our final presentation, we focused on systemic environmental racism in the United States. According to Environment and Society, environmental racism can be defined as the notion that race, more than any other factor, accounts for the disproportionate exposure of minority populations to environmental and public health dangers associated with pollution of all kinds, including toxic disposal sites and industrial effluents. This topic matters because environmental racism affects people's health, education, housing, and overall quality of life. When certain communities are forced to live with more pollution, they face higher risks of having health problems. Environmental racism shows that environmental issues are also social justice issues because not everyone experiences pollution and climate risk equally.
Environmental racism means communities of color are more likely to experience pollution, toxic waste, unsafe water, and neglected infrastructure. One major event that brought national attention to this issue was the Warren County protests in North Carolina in 1982. Residents protested a toxic PCB landfill being placed in a mostly Black and low-income community, which helped spark the environmental justice movement. Later, the 1987 Toxic Waste and Race Report showed that race was one of the biggest factors in determining where hazardous waste sites were located. Examples like the Flint water crisis and uranium mining on Navajo land show how environmental racism is still connected to inequality, power, and who is protected from environmental harm.
Structured environmental racism is driven by a range of interconnected forces, including racial hierarchy, redlining, privileged white framing, racial capitalism, and settler colonialism. Together, these systems shape who benefits from environmental resources and who bears environmental harm. Even though race is often described as a social construct that has very real and lasting consequences, historically, communities labeled as others have been systemically excluded and disproportionately exposed to environmental risks. This unequal distribution of environmental goods, like clean air and water, and bads, like pollution and waste sites, shows how deeply systemic racism is embedded in institutions. Addressing environmental racism requires collective action. It means building public alliances and transforming institutions that have traditionally centered white perspectives while overlooking marginalized communities. The environmental justice movement, which began in the late 1970s, demonstrates what is possible when communities come together to advocate for change and demand equity.
One of the biggest current debates about environmental racism is redlining. Redlining is the process of denying ownership or financial services to people based on their race. This practice started during the Jim Crow era to prevent people of color from being able to live or own a home in nicer neighborhoods. This prevented their ability to build generational wealth, leaving a gap between them and white people. This created neighborhoods segregated by color. Neighborhoods that have a majority people of color often have increased pollution. Studies show that people of color experience greater than average levels of air pollution based on their residence. Redlining has lasting effects on both generational wealth and health. Many people believe that because redlining was outlawed, it no longer affects people today. This way of thinking fails to understand the generational impact of policies. Another big debate is the steps that should be taken to address environmental racism. Some believe that nothing should be done because it is simply a waste of resources to try and mend something that is currently equal under the law. However, others believe that reparations are needed for people of color. Suggested reparations range from one-time payments to something like providing wealth-building opportunities to people of color. Wealth-building opportunities would involve something such as dispersing real estate in wealthier communities to people of color. This would allow for generational housing in areas with better environmental conditions. There were many articles that provided evidence towards environmental racism. The first article shows how redline neighborhoods still have higher levels of air pollution in current day. The next article shows that minority neighborhoods are often in close proximity to landfills, factories, and many other pollution sources. It shows how race is the biggest factor in proximity to hazardous waste sites as well. Structural racism is outlined in this next article, describing how Black children are more likely to be exposed to lead than any other race. Lead exposure is associated with lower test scores in children, which can impact future success and therefore future wealth. This article shows how the government will allow hazardous waste to be placed in towns with large minority populations due to the lack of wealth or representation to prevent it from happening. The last article shows how the government abandoned native Navajos who helped work uranium mines on their land. The government left the mines contaminated with uranium near neighboring towns, which led to many negative health impacts for the natives. These health impacts included cancer, impaired kidney function, and other issues.
For our presentation, there are several class readings that help show that environmental racism is not random. It is shaped by race, power, policy, and the larger systems that decide who gets protected and who gets harmed. The United Church of Christ report from 1987 supports our argument that hazardous waste sites were more likely to be placed in communities of colors. It helps show that environmental racism is connected to race and policy, not just by coincidence. Bullard's 1990 reading also connects to our topic because it explains how Black communities have historically faced more pollution and toxic waste exposure. His work helps show that environmental justice is really a civil rights issue. Bullard's 2000 article also connects to our solutions because it shows how grassroots activism can influence public policy. Community members organized, raised awareness, and pushed the government to take environmental, health, and civil rights issues more seriously. In Chapter 8 of the textbook, Castry helps explain that environmental problems are shaped by the ideas and institutions society uses to understand them. This supports our point that environmental racism is again part of a larger system, not just an isolated incident. Robbins' hints and more in Chapter 11 of their novel also connect to our argument because they show that environmental harm is shaped by society. Pollution and toxic waste do not affect everyone equally, and they also show that inequality is created by social and political systems. Chapter 4 of this same book is useful as well because it helps explain that institutions, meaning rules, policies, and norms, shape how land and resources are distributed. That connects directly to our redlining section of the PowerPoint. And finally, the self-regulating market section of Chapter 7 in the book, Polanyi's book, shows that environmental harm is tied to economic systems as well. Polanyi argues that markets often treat land and nature like things to be sold, which connects to our presentation because it shows how communities and land can be treated like commodities instead of being protected. Overall, all of these readings support our main point that environmental racism is not accidental. It is built into larger systems, and that is why it keeps affecting marginalized communities today.
Throughout this presentation, we've explored the background, causes, and lasting impacts of environmental racism and how it continues to shape communities today. This issue is critical because it directly affects the health and well-being of individuals and families all across the world. Addressing it requires collective action, especially through community organizing and advocacy to challenge the inequitable systems and institutions that allow these disparities to persist. As we move forward, I encourage you to reflect on your own community. What does environmental racism look like where you live? Who is most affected and why? And importantly, what role can you play in addressing it? Racism often operates in subtle and quiet ways, which makes it especially pervasive and difficult to dismantle, but is very real. Acknowledging these inequities is the first and most essential step towards creating meaningful change and building a more just and equitable society. Throughout this presentation, we've explored the background, causes, and lasting impacts of environmental racism and how it continues to shape communities today. This issue is critical because it directly affects the health and well-being of individuals and families all across the world. Addressing it requires collective action, especially through community organizing and advocacy to challenge the inequitable systems and institutions that allow these disparities to persist. As we move forward, I encourage you to reflect on your own community. What does environmental racism look like where you live? Who is most affected and why? And importantly, what role can you play in addressing it? Racism often operates in subtle and quiet ways, which makes it especially pervasive and difficult to dismantle, but it is very real. Acknowledging these inequities is the first and most essential step towards creating meaningful change and building a more just and equitable society.